Whew. Okay, I made it. I barely made it, but I made it. I might have been upstairs working on something else and didn't pay attention to the time. Looked at my phone. Was like, no, I've got 4 minutes. Run! But I made it. So, hello and welcome everyone. Wherever you are, whatever the time is, it's obviously bedtime. And I, of course, am obvious. You're almost late obvious, but nonetheless, still obvious. I hope everyone is well, and I hope you all have wonderful COVID-safe holiday plans that you're about to embark on. I didn't slide, slip, trip, fall, tumble down the stairs. I ran down the stairs. Not the same thing, and totally okay. I'm allowed to run down the stairs provided my feet don't go out from under me, and then I go, dignity over tea kettle. And land upon my posterity. In any case, I hope you all enjoyed the, hey little man, I hope you all enjoyed the holiday stories and poems from yesterday. And we're going to continue with some more today. And we've got some holiday stories by Frank L. Baum and Dostoevsky and a few others to share with you today. I really do need a just like chatting screen to transition to, like before we get to the main story, but after the like starting soon and instead of the be right back. I think I should make one of those. Let's switch to holiday stories. Yay, transitions. Better get of it. Okay. Better get on it? Maybe? Okay. Better get on it. That makes a lot more sense. Well, good morning to you, and I'm glad you decided to start your day with me. That's awesome. I was just talking to the mod on a new book and reading Discord that I joined. One of the ones that I was a member of is shutting down. And so everybody's looking for new homes. And oh my god, a pot of tea. Thank you, thank you. The most amazing person in the world just brought me a pot of hot tea. And some anti-inflammatories. Been resting a bunch and I do feel much better. Still trying to take it a little bit easy on my stomach. But much better than I was. In any case, I was thinking we might start with a story called The Red Shoes. And then from there, we'd move on to Dostoevsky. So, The Red Shoes. There was once a little girl who was very pretty and delicate, but in summer she was forced to run about with bare feet. She was so poor, and in winter wear very large wooden shoes, which made her little insteps quite red, and that looked so dangerous. In the middle of the village lived old Dame Shoemaker. She sate and sewed together as well as she could a little pair of shoes out of old red strips of cloth. They were very clumsy, but it was a kind thought. They were meant for the little girl. The little girl was called Karen. We're going fancy today? What did we do that was fancy? On the very day her mother was buried, Karen received the red shoes and wore them for the first time. They were certainly not intended for mourning, but she had no others. And with stockingless feet, she followed the poor straw coffin in them. Suddenly, a large old carriage drove up, and a large old lady sat in it. She looked at the little girl, felt compassion for her, and then said to the clergyman, "Here, give me the little girl. I will adopt her." And Karen believed all this happened on account of the red shoes, but the old lady thought they were horrible, and they were burnt. But Karen herself was cleanly and nicely dressed. She must learn to read and sew, and people said she was a nice little thing. But the looking glass said, "Thou art more than nice. Thou art beautiful." Now the queen once traveled through the land, and she had her little daughter with her. And this little daughter was a princess, and people streamed to the castle, and Karen was there also. And the little princess stood in her fine white dress in a window and let herself be stared at. She had neither a train nor a golden crown, but splendid red Morocco shoes. They were certainly far handsomer than those Dame Shoemaker had made for little Karen. Nothing in the world can be compared with red shoes. Now Karen was old enough to be confirmed. She had new clothes and was about to have new shoes also. The rich shoemaker in the city took measure of her little foot. This took place at his house, in his room, where stood large glass cases, filled with elegant shoes and brilliant boots. All this looked charming, but the old lady could not see well, and so had no pleasure in them. In the midst of the shoes stood a pair of red ones, just like those the princess had worn. How beautiful they were! The shoemaker said also that they had been made for the child of a count, but had not fitted. "That must be patent leather," said the old lady. "They shine so." "Yes, they shine," said Karen, "and they fitted and were bought." But the old lady knew nothing about their being red, else she would never have allowed Karen to have gone in red shoes to be confirmed. Yet such was the case. Everybody looked at her feet, and when she stepped through the chancel door on the church pavement, it seemed to her as if the old figures on the tombs, those portraits of old preachers and preachers' wives, with stiff ruffs and long black dresses, fixed their eyes on her red shoes. And she thought only of them as the clergyman laid his hand upon her head, and spoke of the holy baptism, of the covenant with God, and how she should be now a matured Christian. And the organ pealed so solemnly, the sweet children's voices sang, and the old music director sang, but Karen only thought of her red shoes. In the afternoon, the old lady heard from every one that the shoes had been red, and she said that it was very wrong of Karen, that it was not at all becoming, and in the future Karen should only go in black shoes to church, even when she should be older. The next Sunday there was the sacrament, and Karen looked at the black shoes, looked at the red ones, looked at them again, and put on the red shoes. The sun shone gloriously. Karen and the old lady walked along the path through the corn. It was rather dusty there. At the church door stood an old soldier with a crutch, and with a wonderfully long beard, which was more red than white, and he bowed to the ground, and asked the old lady whether he might dust her shoes. And Karen stretched out her little foot. "See, what beautiful dancing shoes," said the soldier. "Sit firm when you dance." And he put his hand out towards the soles. And the old lady gave the old soldier an alms, and went into the church with Karen. And all the people in the church looked at Karen's red shoes, and all the pictures, and as Karen knelt before the altar, and raised the cup to her lips, she only thought of the red shoes, and they seemed to swim in it, and she forgot to sing her psalm, and she forgot to pray, "Our Father in heaven." Now, all the people went out of church, and the old lady got into her carriage. Karen raised her foot to get in after her, when the old soldier said, "Look, what beautiful dancing shoes." And Karen could not help dancing a step or two, and when she began, her feet continued to dance. It was just as though the shoes had power over them. She danced round the church corner. She could not leave off. The coachman was obliged to run after and catch hold of her, and he lifted her in the carriage, but her feet continued to dance so that she trod on the old lady dreadfully. At length she took the shoes off, and then her legs had peace. The shoes were placed in a closet at home, but Karen could not avoid looking at them. Now the old lady was sick, and it was said she could not recover. She must be nursed and waited upon, and there was no one whose duty it was so much as Karen's. But there was a great ball in the city, to which Karen was invited. She looked at the old lady, who could not recover. She looked at the red shoes, and she thought there could be no sin in it. She put on the red shoes. She might do that also, she thought. But then she went to the ball and began to dance. When she wanted to dance to the right, the shoes would dance to the left. And when she wanted to dance up the room, the shoes danced back again, down the steps, into the street, and out of the city gate. She danced, and she was forced to dance straight out into the gloomy wood. Then it was suddenly light up among the trees, and she fancied it must be the moon, for there was a face. But it was the old soldier with the red beard. He sat there, nodded his head, and said, "Look, what beautiful dancing shoes." Then she was terrified, and wanted to fling off the red shoes, but they clung fast, and she pulled down her stockings, but the shoes seemed to have grown to her feet. And she danced and must dance, over fields and meadows, in rain and sunshine, by night and day. But at night it was the most fearful. She danced over the churchyard, but the dead did not dance. They had something better to do than to dance. She wished to seat herself on a poor man's grave, where the bitter tansy grew, but for her there was neither peace nor rest. And when she danced toward the open church door, she saw an angel standing there. He wore long white garments. He had wings which reached from his shoulders to the earth. His countenance was severe and grave, and in his hand he held a sword, broad and glittering. "Dance shalt thou," said he. "Dance in thy red shoes till thou art pale and cold, till thy skin shrivels up and thou art a skeleton. Dance shalt thou from door to door, and where proud vain children dwell, thou shalt knock, that they may hear thee and tremble. Dance shalt thou." "Mercy!" cried Karen. But she did not hear the angel's reply, for the shoes carried her through the gate into the fields, across roads and bridges, and she must keep ever dancing. One morning she danced past a door which she well knew. Within sounded a psalm. A coffin, decked with flowers, was borne forth. Then she knew that the old lady was dead, and felt that she was abandoned by all, and condemned by the angel of God. She danced, and she was forced to dance through the gloomy night. The shoes carried her over stack and stone. She was torn till she bled. She danced over the heath till she came to a little house. Here, she knew, dwelt the executioner, and she tapped with her fingers at the window and said, "Come out, come out! I cannot come in, for I am forced to dance." And the executioner said, "Thou dost not know who I am, I fancy? I strike bad people's heads off, and I hear that my axe rings." "Don't strike my head off," said Karen. "Then I can't repent of my sins, but strike off my feet and the red shoes." And then she confessed her entire sin, and the executioner struck off her feet with the red shoes, but the shoes danced away with the little feet across the field into the deep wood. And he carved out little wooden feet for her, and crutches, taught her the psalm criminals always sing, and she kissed the hand which had wielded the axe and went over the heath. This is kind of dark. "Now I have suffered enough for the red shoes," said she. "Now I will go into the church, that people may see me." And she hastened toward the church door. But when she was near it, the red shoes danced before her, and she was terrified and turned round. The whole week she was unhappy and wept many bitter tears. But when Sunday returned, she said, "Well, now I have suffered and struggled enough. I really believe I am as good as many a one who sits in the church and holds her head so high." Seems like even though she's lost her feet, she didn't learn her lesson. And away she went boldly, but she had not got farther than the churchyard gate before she saw the red shoes dancing before her, and she was frightened, and turned back and repented of her sin from her heart. And she went to the parsonage, and begged that they would take her into service. She would be very industrious, she said, and would do everything she could. She did not care about the wages, only she wished to have a home and be with good people. And the clergyman's wife was sorry for her and took her into service, and she was industrious and thoughtful. She sat still and listened when the clergyman read the Bible in the evenings. All the children thought a deal of her, but when they spoke of dress and grandeur and beauty, she shook her head. The following Sunday, when the family was going to church, they asked her whether she would not go with them, but she glanced sorrowfully, with tears in her eyes, at her crutches. The family went to hear the word of God, but she went alone into her little chamber. There was only room for a bed and a chair to stand in it, and here she sat down with her prayer book. And while she read with a pious mind, the wind bore the strains of the organ toward her, and she raised her tearful countenance and said, "O God, help me." And the sun shone so clearly, and straight before her stood the angel of God in white garments, the same she had seen that night at the church door. But he no longer carried the sharp sword, but in its stead a splendid green spray full of roses. And he touched the ceiling with the spray, and the ceiling rose so high, and where he had touched it there gleamed a golden star. And when he touched the walls, and they widened out, and she saw the organ which was playing, she saw the old pictures of the preachers and the preachers' wives. The congregation sat in cushioned seats and sang out of their prayer books, for the church itself had come to the poor girl in her narrow chamber, or else she had come into the church. Yeah. She sat in the pew with the clergyman's family. When they had ended the psalm and looked up, they nodded and said, "It is right that thou art come." It was through mercy, she said. And the organ pealed, and the children's voices in the choir sounded so sweet and soft. The clear sunshine streamed so warmly through the window into the pew where Karen sat. Her heart was so full of joy and peace and sunshine that it broke. Her soul flew on the sunshine to God, and there no one asked after the red shoes. All right, so did Hans Christian Andersen just have a thing against little girls? I mean, that's 2 in a row where they've just up and died at the end of the story. That's supposed to be a collection of Christmas stories, but that one didn't seem very Christmassy. It's kind of the danger, I suppose, of reading stories that I've never read before. A little bit of a hazard to the plan. So that wasn't a very Christmassy one, so I apologize for that. Let alone a holiday one. Now, let's see. It'd be nice if this one had a table of contents. Oh, here we go. All right. Like religious Grimm brothers? Or Brothers Grimm? Yeah, maybe a bit. All right. We'll do Dostoevsky, and then how about some Beatrix Potter? Sound good to everybody? Kind of jump all around the world. All right. The Christmas Tree and the Wedding by Dostoevsky. The other day, you don't know either of those authors? Well worth reading, both of them. It's about a little boy wanting to buy shoes for his sick mother so that she has them when she meets Jesus on Christmas Day. Yeah, that would have been at least more of a holiday story, I suppose. The other day I saw a wedding, but no, I would rather tell you about a Christmas tree. The wedding was superb. I liked it immensely, but the other incident was still finer. I don't know why it is that the sight of the wedding reminded me of the Christmas tree. This is the way it happened. Well, hopefully this one isn't as sad. Exactly 5 years ago, on New Year's Eve, I was invited to a children's ball by a man high up in the business world, who had his connections his circle of acquaintances, and his intrigues. So it seemed as though the children's ball was merely a pretext for the parents to come together and discuss matters of interest to themselves, quite innocently and casually. I was an outsider, and, as I had no special matters to air, I was able to spend the evening independently of the others. There was another gentleman present who, like myself, had just stumbled upon this affair of domestic bliss. He was the first to attract my attention. His appearance was not that of a man of birth or high family. He was tall, rather thin, very serious, and well-dressed. Apparently he had no heart for the family festivities. The instant he went off into a corner by himself, the smile disappeared from his face, and his thick, dark brows knitted into a frown. He knew no one except the host, and showed every sign of being bored to death, though bravely sustaining the role of thorough enjoyment to the end. Later, I learned that he was a provincial, had come to the capital on some important, brain-racking business, and had brought a letter of recommendation to our host. And our host had taken him under his protection, not at all con amour. It was merely out of politeness that he had invited him to the children's ball. They did not play cards with him. They did not offer him cigars. No one entered into conversation with him. Possibly they recognized the bird by its feathers from a distance. Thus, my gentleman, not knowing what to do with his hands, was compelled to spend the evening stroking his whiskers. His whiskers were really fine, but he stroked them so assiduously that one got the feeling that the whiskers had come into the world first, and afterward the man in order to stroke them. Wow, definitely going dark in the chat today. There was another guest who interested me, but he was of quite a different order. He was a personage. They called him Julian Mostakovich. At first glance, one could tell he was an honored guest, and stood in the same relation to the host as the host to the gentleman of the whiskers. The host and hostess said no end of amiable things to him, were most attentive, whining him and hovering over him, bringing guests up to be introduced, but never leading him to anyone else. I noticed tears glisten in our host's eyes when Julian Mostakovich remarked that he had rarely spent such a pleasant evening. Somehow, I began to feel uncomfortable in this personage's presence. So after amusing myself with the children, 5 of whom, remarkably well-fed young persons, were our hosts, I went into a little sitting room, entirely unoccupied, and seated myself at the end that was a conservatory, and took up almost half the room. The children were charming. They absolutely refused to resemble their elders, notwithstanding the efforts of mothers and governesses. In a jiffy, they had denuded the Christmas tree down to the very last sweet, and had already succeeded in breaking half of their playthings before they even found out which belonged to whom. One of them was a particularly handsome little lad, dark-eyed, curly-haired, who stubbornly persisted in aiming at me with his wooden gun. But the child that attracted the greatest attention was his sister, a girl of about 11, lovely as a cupid. She was quiet and thoughtful, with large, full, dreamy eyes. The children had somehow offended her, and she left them and walked into the same room that I had withdrawn into. There, she seated herself with her doll in a corner. Her father is an immensely wealthy businessman, the guests informed each other in tones of awe. 300,000 rubles set aside for her dowry already. As I turned to look at the group from which I heard this news item issuing, my glance met Julian Mostakovich. He stood listening to the insipid chatter in an attitude of concentrated attention, with his hands behind his back and his head inclined to one side. All the while I was quite lost in admiration of the shrewdness of our host displayed in the dispensing of the gifts. The little maid of the many ruby dowry received the handsomest doll, and the rest of the gifts were graded in value according to the diminishing scale of the parents' stations in life. The last child, a tiny chap of 10, thin, red-haired, and freckled, came into possession of a small book of nature stories without illustrations, or even head and tail pieces. He was the governess's child. She was a poor widow, and her little boy, clad in a sorry-looking little nankeen jacket, looked thoroughly crushed and intimidated. He took the book of nature stories and circled slowly about the children's toys. He would have given anything to play with them, but he did not dare to. You could tell he already knew his place. I like to observe children. It is fascinating to watch the individuality in them struggling for self-assertion. I could see that the other children's things had tremendous charm for the red-haired boy, especially a toy theater in which he was so anxious to take a part that he resolved to fawn upon the other children. He smiled and began to play with them. His one and only apple he handed over to a puffy urchin whose pockets were already crammed with sweets, and he even carried another youngster piggyback, all simply that he might be allowed to stay with the theater. But in a few moments, an impudent young person fell on him and gave him a pummeling. He did not dare even to cry. The governess came and told him to leave off interfering with the other children's games, and he crept away to the same room the little girl and I were in. She let him sit down beside her, and the two set themselves busily dressing the expensive doll. Almost half an hour passed, and I was nearly dozing off as I sat there in the conservatory, half listening to the chatter of the red-haired boy and the dowered beauty, when Julian Mastakovich entered suddenly. He had slipped out of the drawing-room under cover of a noisy scene among the children. From my secluded corner it had not escaped my notice that a few moments before he had been eagerly conversing with the rich girl's father, to whom he had only just been introduced. He stood still for a while, reflecting and mumbling to himself, as if counting something on his fingers. 300, 311, 12, 13, 16 in 5 years. Let's say 4%, 5 times 12, 60, and on these 60, let us assume that in 5 years it will amount to, well, 400. But the shrewd old fox isn't likely to be satisfied with 4%. He gets 8 or even 10 perhaps. Let's suppose 500. 500,000 at least, that's sure. Anything above that for pocket money. He blew his nose and was about to leave the room when he spied the girl and stood still. I, behind the plants, escaped his notice. He seemed to me to be quivering with excitement. It must have been his calculations that upset him so. He rubbed his hands and danced from place to place, and kept getting more and more excited. Finally, however, he conquered his emotions and came to a standstill. He cast a determined look at the future bride and wanted to move toward her, but glanced about first. Then, as if with a guilty conscience, he stepped over to the child on tiptoe, smiling, and bent down and kissed her head, and then got punched in the face. His coming was so unexpected that she uttered a shriek of alarm. "What are you doing here, dear child?" he whispered, looking around and pinching her cheek. "We're playing." "What? With him," said Julian Mastakovich, with a look askance at the governess's child. "You should go into the drawing-room, my lad," he said to him. The boy remained silent and looked up at the man with wide-open eyes. Julian Mastakovich glanced round again cautiously and bent down over the girl. "What have you got? A doll, my dear?" "Yes, sir." The child quailed a little and her brow wrinkled. "A doll. And do you know, my dear, what dolls are made of?" "No, sir," she said weakly and lowered her head. "Out of rags, my dear. You, boy, you go back to the drawing-room, to the children," said Julian Mastakovich, looking at the boy sternly. The two children frowned. They caught hold of each other and would not part. "And do you know why they gave you the doll?" asked Julian Mastakovich, dropping his voice lower and lower. "No, because you were a good, very good little girl the whole week." Saying which, Julian Mastakovich was seized with a paroxysm of agitation. He looked round and said in a tone faint, almost inaudible with excitement and impatience, "If I come to visit your parents, will you love me, my dear?" He tried to kiss the... Jesus Christ. Yeah. I mean, I understand that they contracted for marriage at early years. And I get that. And I get that, like Romeo and Juliet were, 14, I think, or something like that. And that family alliances were made and there were more business transactions. I also get that this dude is interested in the dowry and not in the girl, but I'm scanning ahead. So, huh. All right. So the wedding he saw um, was the wedding of Mastkovich and the girl was 16 at the time and still looked beautiful, but uh, drawn and desperate, and like she was pleading for mercy from the crowd around. And seeing that wedding put him in mind of the Christmas tree and that party where they met. And it ends with the author or the narrator remarking that Julian was correct in his calculations because the dowry did end up being 500,000. But we are going to skip to Beatrix Potter because, yeah, I'm not liking that story. Sorry, I don't like, even if it was historically accurate and something that happened, that's not how things are now, and it's not how things should have been, and I don't like it at all. So I should have known since it was Russian that it was going to be dark. All right. Let me take my hoodie off, and then we will start with The Tailor of Gloucester by Beatrix Potter, which should be, knowing the author, a much better story. All right. The Tailor of Gloucester by Beatrix Potter. In the time of swords and periwigs, and full-skirted coats with flowered lappets, when gentlemen wore ruffles and gold-laced waistcoats of paduasoy and taffeta, there lived a tailor in Gloucester. He sat in the window of a little shop in Westgate, cross-legged on a table from morning till dark. All day long, while the light lasted, he sewed and snippeted, piecing out his satin and pompadour and lute-string. Stuffs had strange names and were very expensive in the days of the Tailor of Gloucester. But although he sewed fine silk for his neighbors, he himself was very, very poor. A little old man in spectacles, with a pinched face, old crooked fingers, and a suit of threadbare clothes. Yeah, but on the flip side, Romeo is at least, like, age appropriate. He's very young. He's, within spitting distance of her age. So, the the Julians of the world were not quite so close. He cut his coats without waste, according to his embroidered cloth. They were very small ends and snippets that lay about upon the table. Too narrow breadths for naught, except waistcoats for mice, said the tailor. One bitter cold day near Christmas time, the tailor began to make a coat of cherry-colored corded silk, embroidered with pansies and roses, and a cream-colored satin waistcoat, trimmed with gauze and green worsted chenille for the mayor of Gloucester. The tailor worked, and he talked to himself. He measured the silk and turned it round, and trimmed it into shape with his shears. The table was all littered with cherry-colored snippets. No breadth at all, and cut on the cross. It is no breadth at all. Tippets for mice and ribbons for mobs. For mice, said the tailor of Gloucester. When the snowflakes came down against the small leaded window panes and shut out the light, the tailor had done his day's work. All the silk and satin lay cut out upon the table. There were 12 pieces for the coat and 4 pieces for the waistcoat, and there were pocket flaps and cuffs and buttons all in order. For the lining of the coat there was fine yellow taffeta, and for the buttonholes of the waistcoat there was cherry-colored twist. And everything was ready to sew together in the morning, all measured and sufficient, except that there was wanting just one single skein of cherry-colored twisted silk. The tailor came out of his shop at dark, for he did not sleep there at nights. He fastened the window and locked the door, and took away the key. No one lived there at night but little brown mice, and they run in and out without any keys. For behind the wooden wainscots of all the old houses in Gloucester, there are little mouse staircases and secret trapdoors, and the mice run from house to house through those long, narrow passages. They can run all over the town without going into the streets. But the tailor came out of his shop and shuffled home through the snow. He lived quite near by in College Court, next the doorway to College Green, and although it was not a big house, the tailor was so poor he only rented the kitchen. He lived alone with his cat. It was called Simpkin. Now all day long while the tailor was out at work, Simpkin kept house by himself, and he also was fond of the mice, though he gave them no satin for coats. "Meow," said the cat when the tailor opened the door. "Meow?" The tailor replied, "Simpkin, we shall make our fortune, but I am worn to a ravelling. Take this groat, which is our last 4 pence, and Simpkin, take a china pipkin, buy a pen'orth of bread, a pen'orth of milk, and a pen'orth of sausages. Oh, Simpkin, with the last penny of our 4 pence, buy me 1 pen'orth of cherry-colored silk. But do not lose the last penny of the 4 pence, Simpkin, or I am undone and worn to a thread paper, for I have no more twist." Man, I wish I could send my animals out on errands. Then Simpkin again said meow, and took the groat and the pipkin and went out into the dark. The tailor was very tired and beginning to be ill. He sat down by the hearth and talked to himself about that wonderful coat. Did you guys see the video of the dog driving the car in the cul-de-sac? It went around like social media and the internet for a while. I wonder if that's what the guy was thinking, that he'd teach his dog to go run errands. The tailor was very tired and beginning to be ill. He sat down by the hearth and talked to himself about that wonderful coat. "I shall make my fortune, to be cut bias. The mayor of Gloucester is to be married on Christmas Day in the morning, and he hath ordered a coat and an embroidered waistcoat to be lined with yellow taffeta, and the taffeta sufficeth. There is no more left over in snippets than will serve to make tippets for mice." Then the tailor started, for suddenly, interrupting him from the dresser at the other side of the kitchen, came a number of little noises. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip-tap-tip. "Now what can that be?" said the tailor of Gloucester, jumping up from his chair. The dresser was covered with crockery and pipkins, willow-patterned plates, and teacups and mugs. The tailor crossed the kitchen and stood quite still beside the dresser, listening and peering through his spectacles. Again, from under a teacup came those funny little noises. Tip-tap, tip-tap, tip-tap-tip. "This is very peculiar," said the tailor of Gloucester, and he lifted up the teacup, which was upside down. Out stepped a little live lady mouse, and made a curtsy to the tailor. Then she hopped away down off the dresser and under the wainscot. The tailor sat down again by the fire, warming his poor cold hands and mumbling to himself. "The waistcoat is cut out from peach-colored satin, tambour stitch and rosebuds and beautiful floss silk. Was I wise to entrust my last 4 pence to Simpkin? 21 buttonholes of cherry-colored twist. But all at once, from the dresser, there came other little noises. Tip-tap, 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 tip. "This is passing extraordinary," said the tailor of Gloucester, and turned over another teacup, which was upside down. Out stepped a little gentleman mouse, and made a bow to the tailor. And then from all over the dresser came a chorus of little tappings, all sounding together and answering one another, like watch beetles in an old worm-eaten window shutter. Tip-tap, 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 tip. And out from under teacups and from under bowls and basins stepped other and more little mice, who hopped away down off the dresser and under the wainscot. The tailor sat down, close over the fire, lamenting, 21 buttonholes of cherry-colored silk, to be finished by noon of Saturday, and this is Tuesday evening. Was it right to let loose those mice, undoubtedly the property of Simpkin? Alack, I am undone, for I have no more twist. The little mice came out again and listened to the tailor. They took notice of the pattern of that wonderful coat. They whispered to one another about the taffeta lining and about little mouse tippets. And then all at once they all ran away together down the passage behind the wainscot, squeaking and calling to one another. And as they ran from house to house, and not one mouse was left in the tailor's kitchen when Simpkin came back with the pipkin of milk. Simpkin opened the door and bounced in with an angry meow, like a cat that is vexed, for he hated the snow, and there was snow in his ears and snow in his collar at the back of his neck. He put down the loaf and the sausages upon the dresser and sniffed. "Simpkin," said the tailor, "where is my twist?" But Simpkin set down the pipkin of milk upon the dresser and looked suspiciously at the teacups. He wanted his supper of little fat mouse. "Simpkin," said the tailor, "where is my twist?" But Simpkin hid a little parcel privately in the teapot and spit and growled at the tailor. And if Simpkin had been able to talk, he would have asked, "Where is my mouse?" "Alack, I am undone," said the tailor of Gloucester, and went sadly to bed. All that night long Simpkin hunted and searched through the kitchen, peeping into cupboards and under the wainscot, and into the teapot where he had hidden that twist, but still he found never a mouse. Whenever the tailor muttered and talked in his sleep, Simpkin said, "Meow, grush," and made strange horrid noises, as cats do at night. For the poor old tailor was very ill with a fever, tossing and turning in his four-post bed, and still in his dreams he mumbled, "No more twist, no more twist." All that day he was ill, and the next day and the next, and what should become of the cherry-colored coat? In the tailor's shop in Westgate Street, the embroidered silk and satin lay cut out upon the table, 21 buttonholes, and who should come to sew them when the window was barred and the door was fast locked? But that does not hinder the little brown mice. They run in and out without any keys through all the old houses in Gloucester. Out of doors the market folks went trudging through the snow to buy their geese and turkeys and to bake their Christmas pies. But there would be no Christmas dinner for Simpkin and the poor old tailor of Gloucester. The tailor lay ill for 3 days and nights, and then it was Christmas Eve and very late at night. The moon climbed up over the roofs and chimneys and looked down over the gateway into College Court. There were no lights in the windows, nor any sound in the houses. All the city of Gloucester was fast asleep under the snow. And still Simpkin wanted his mice, and he mewed as he stood beside the four-post bed. But it is in the old story that all the beasts can talk, in the night between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day in the morning, though there are very few folk that can hear them, or know what it is that they say. When the cathedral clock struck 12, there was an answer, like an echo of the chimes, and Simpkin heard it and came out of the tailor's door, and wandered about in the snow. From all the roofs and gables and old wooden houses in Gloucester came 1,000 merry voices singing the old Christmas rhymes, all the old songs that I have ever heard of, and some that I don't know, like Whittington's bells. First and loudest the cocks cried out, "Dame, get up and bake your pies." "Oh, dilly, dilly, dilly," sighed Simpkin. And now in a garret there were lights and sounds of dancing, and cats came from over the way. Hey, diddle diddle, the cat and the fiddle, all the cats in Gloucester, except me, said Simpkin. Under the wooden eaves, the starlings and sparrows sang of Christmas pies. The jackdaws woke up in the cathedral tower, and although it was the middle of the night, the throstles and robins sang. The air was quite full of little twittering tunes. But it was all rather provoking to poor hungry Simpkin. Particularly he was vexed with some little shrill voices from behind a wooden lattice. I think that they were bats, because they always have very small voices, especially in a black frost, when they talk in their sleep, like the tailor of Gloucester. They said something mysterious that sounded like, "Buzz," quoth the blue fly, quoth the bee. "Buzz and hum," they cry, "and so do we." And Simpkin went away shaking his ears as if he had a bee in his bonnet. From the tailor's shop in Westgate came a glow of light, and when Simpkin crept up to peep in at the window, it was full of candles. There was a snippeting of scissors and a snappeting of thread, and little mouse voices sang loudly and gaily. 24 tailors went to catch a snail. The best man amongst them durst not touch her tail. She put out her horns like a little Kylo cow. "Run, tailors, run, or she'll have you all eaten now." Then without a pause the little mouse voices went on again. "Sieve my lady's oatmeal, grind my lady's flour, put it in a chestnut, let it stand an hour." "Mew, mew," interrupted Simpkin, and he scratched at the door. But the key was under the tailor's pillow, and he could not get in. The little mice only laughed and tried another tune. 3 little mice sat down to spin. Pussy passed by, and she peeped in. "What are you at, my fine little men?" "Making coats for gentlemen." "Shall I come in and cut off your threads?" "Oh no, Miss Pussy, you'd bite off our heads." "Mew, mew," cried Simpkin. "Hey, diddle dinkety," answered the little mice. "Hey, diddle dinkety, poppity pet. The merchants of London, they wear scarlet. Silk in the collar and gold in the hem. So merrily march the merchant men." They clicked their thimbles to mark the time, but none of the songs pleased Simpkin. He sniffed and mewed at the door of the shop. "And then I bought a pipkin and a popkin, a slipkin and a slopkin, all for 1 farthing. And upon the kitchen dresser," added the rude little mice. "Mew, scratch, scratch," scuffled Simpkin on the window-sill, while the little mice inside sprang to their feet, and all began to shout at once in little twittering voices, "No more twist! No more twist!" And they barred up the window shutters and shut out Simpkin. But still, through the nicks in the shutters, he could hear the click of thimbles and little mouse voices singing, "No more twist! No more twist!" Simpkin came away from the shop and went home, considering in his mind. He found the poor old tailor without fever, sleeping peacefully. Then Simpkin went on tiptoe and took a little parcel of silk out of the teapot and looked at it in the moonlight, and he felt quite ashamed of his badness compared with those good little mice. When the tailor awoke in the morning, the first thing which he saw upon the patchwork quilt was a skein of cherry-colored twisted silk, and beside his bed stood the repentant Simpkin. "Alack, I am worn to a ravelling," said the tailor of Gloucester, "but I have my twist." The sun was shining on the snow when the tailor got up and dressed, and came out into the street, with Simpkin running before him. The starlings whistled on the chimney stacks, and the throstles and robins sang, but they sang their own little noises, not the words they had sang in the night. "Alack," said the tailor, "I have my twist, but no more strength, nor time, than will serve to make me 1 single buttonhole, for this is a Christmas day in the morning. The mayor of Gloucester shall be married by noon, and where is his cherry-colored coat?" He unlocked the door of the little shop in Westgate Street, and Simpkin ran in like a cat that expects something. But there was no one there, not even 1 little brown mouse. The boards were swept clean, the little ends of thread and the little silk snippets were all tidied away and gone from off the floor. But upon the table, oh joy! The tailor gave a shout. There, where he had left plain cuttings of silk, there lay the most beautifulest coat and embroidered satin waistcoat that ever were worn by a mayor of Gloucester. There were roses and pansies upon the facings of the coat, and the waistcoat was worked with poppies and cornflowers. Everything was finished, except just one single cherry-colored buttonhole, and where that buttonhole was wanting, there was pinned a scrap of paper with these words in little teeny-weeny writing, "No more twist." And from then began the luck of the tailor of Gloucester. He grew quite stout, and he grew quite rich. He made the most wonderful waistcoats for all the rich merchants of Gloucester, and for all the fine gentlemen of the country round. Never were seen such ruffles, or such embroidered cuffs and lappets, but his buttonholes were the greatest triumph of it all. The stitches of those buttonholes were so neat, I wonder how they could be stitched by an old man in spectacles, with crooked old fingers and a tailor's thimble. The stitches of those buttonholes were so small, they looked as if they had been made by little mice. In the end. Well, that was a much better story. Happy ending and all. Although I do hope the mice got something for all their work, since apparently they made the tailor rich. Although I suppose he did save all their lives. All right, let's see. Take a short break, and then we'll read The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by Frank L. Baum. Yep, and a warm-up of tea. Anybody else drinking tea this evening? Or this afternoon, or this morning? Whatever time it is for you. It's okay if Panda doesn't like tea. What do you drink instead of tea, Panda? What's your warm drink of choice? Hot cocoa? Right on. I plan on drinking some hot cocoa with a little bit extra in it. Some peppermint schnapps. Depending on how my day is going at the time that I drink it, there may be a little extra peppermint schnapps in it. But I don't have to drive anywhere. I haven't had to drive anywhere most of this year, actually. All right, so I'll put the break screen on so that we can ask some questions of 8-Ball if you'd like. There we go. Maybe I should just say tea break. Maybe I can find some wonderful, awesome person who knows how to get messages in this font to type out tea break in it for me. If only I knew such a person. Couldn't be just any random person. It'd probably have to be a specific random person. But maybe she's not here. I thought she was earlier. In any case, I hope everyone's enjoyed that story. Red Shoes was good, but a bit dark. Didn't care for the Dostoevsky one. He's a great author, but Ah, I didn't care for that one. Hello, Random. How are you? Is your little one listening again today? If so, I'm sorry for the awkward bit there. Okay. Oh, let's try something with 8-Ball. See how snarky 8-Ball's feeling today. Do you know 8-Ball is correct? Let's see. Am I getting coal this year? I should ask Vela. Vela, am I getting coal this year? I just said 8-Ball said to ask Vela, not you, Random. Oh. I actually got coal one year. Did you see that one? Well, I am dreadfully sorry for whatever I did to get on your naughty list. I have not. Lies. Lies and falsifications. Just ran a little late today. That's not the same thing at all. When did I get off the naughty list? I've been good. Let's see what 8-Ball says about this. I may regret asking this question. Ah, look at that. I'm a good person. 8-Ball says so. Nope, didn't happen, Panda. I would never make a scandalous joke in my life. Next, you'll tell me I make terrible puns. Shocking, really. I am a polite and demure young man. I would never engage in such behavior. Positively scandalous. Looks like Panda got on the naughty list. Just got a message that she got auto-moderated for a link, but it deleted every message she'd done. I don't know why it does that. It did that to Random the other day, too. Yeah, I don't understand. Anybody in chat used Streamlabs besides me that knows a little more? Do we maybe have a Megster here somewhere? Maybe. Oh, a message Megster. Alright. I will let you guys know what she says if she gives me an answer, since she's my Yoda with this stuff. Nobody can erase you, Panda. Yes, that is definitely overkill, Sparky. I agree. What I don't understand is why it would do that for Panda, but it can't seem to take out the Big Follows people. That'd be totally okay if it tried to wipe out the Big Follows people from history. Death to the spam bots. Anyway, let's get back to the stories. And if you've been enjoying the stream, if you enjoy the videos and recordings and whatnot, please do hit that follow button, subscribe on YouTube, all that sort of thing. Please join us in the Discord. Discord link's already up, so no need to do the Discord link, Vela, unless you've already typed it in. But yeah. So come join us, hang out. We play games during the week and that sort of thing. Just started with the new Stardew Valley update. I'll answer for 8-Ball. You should absolutely make more than 2 types of cookies. Or at least more than 2 batches. And then you should send me some cookies. Nom 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 nom. Alright. Back to the story. We're going to read The Life and Adventures of Santa Claus by Frank Albaum. Alright. So, the first section is entitled Youth. Chapter 1, Burzee. Have you heard of the great forest of Burzee? Nurse used to sing of it when I was a child. She sang of the big tree trunks standing close together, with the roots intertwining below the earth, and their branches intertwining above it, of their rough coating of bark and queer gnarled limbs, of the bushy foliage that roofed the entire forest, save where the sunbeams found a path through which to touch the ground in little spots, and to cast weird and curious shadows over the mosses, the lichens, and the drifts of dried leaves. The forest of Burzee is mighty and grand, and awesome to those who steal beneath its shade. Coming from the sunlit meadows into its mazes, it seems at first gloomy, and then pleasant, and afterward filled with never-ending delights. For hundreds of years it has flourished in all its magnificence, the silence of its enclosure unbroken save by the chirp of busy chipmunks, the growl of wild beasts, and the songs of the birds. Yet Burzee has its inhabitants, for all this. Nature peopled it in the beginning with fairies, nooks, rills, and nymphs. As long as the forest stands, it will be a home, a refuge and a playground to these sweet immortals who revel undisturbed in its depths. Civilization has never yet reached Burzee. Will it ever, I wonder? The child of the forest. Once, so long ago, our great-grandfathers could scarcely have heard it mentioned. There lived within the great forest of Burzee a wood nymph named Necile. She was closely related to the mighty Queen Zerline, and her home was beneath the shade of a wide-spreading oak. Once every year, on budding day, when the trees put forth their new buds, Necile held the golden chalice of Ak to the lips of the queen, who drank therefrom to the prosperity of the forest. So you see, she was a nymph of some importance, and moreover, it is said she was highly regarded because of her beauty and grace. When she was created, she could not have told. Queen Zerline could not have told. The great Ak himself could not have told. It was long ago, when the world was new, and nymphs were needed to guard the forests and to minister to the wants of the young trees. Then, on some day not remembered, Necile sprang into being, radiant, lovely, straight and slim as the saplings she was created to guard. Her hair was the color that lines a chestnut burr. Her eyes were blue in the sunlight, and purple in the shade. Her cheeks bloomed with the faint pink that edges the clouds at sunset. Her lips were full, red, pouting and sweet. For costume, she adopted oak leaf green. All the wood nymphs dress in that color, and no other so desirable. Her dainty feet were sandal-clad, while her head remained bare of covering other than her silken tresses. Necile's duties were few and simple. She kept hurtful weeds from growing beneath her trees and sapping the earth food required by her charges. She frightened away the gadgulls, who took evil delight in flying against the tree trunks and wounding them so that they drooped and died from the poisonous contact. In dry seasons, she carried water from the brooks and pools and moistened the roots of her thirsty dependents. That was in the beginning. The weeds had now learned to avoid the forests where wood nymphs dwelt. The loathsome gadgulls no longer dared come nigh. The trees had become old and sturdy, and could bear the drought better than when fresh sprouted. So Necile's duties were lessened, and time grew laggard, while succeeding years became more tiresome and uneventful than the nymph's joyous spirit loved. Truly, the forest dwellers did not lack amusement. Each full moon they danced in the royal circle of the queen. There were also the feast of nuts, the jubilee of autumn tintings, the solemn ceremony of leaf shedding, and the revelry of budding day. But these periods of enjoyment were far apart, and left many weary hours between. That a wood nymph should grow discontented was not thought of by Necile's sisters. It came upon her only after many years of brooding. But when once she had settled in her mind that life was irksome, she had no patience with her condition, and longed to do something of real interest, and to pass her days in ways hitherto undreamed of by forest nymphs. The law of the forest alone restrained her from going forth in search of adventure. While this mood lay heavy upon pretty Necile, it chanced that the great Ak visited the forest of Burzee, and allowed the wood nymphs, as was their wont, to lie at his feet and listen to the words of wisdom that fell from his lips. Ak is the master woodsman of the world. He sees everything and knows more than the sons of men. Aw, I want some cheesecake. Cheesecake. That night, he held the queen's hand, for he loved the nymphs as a father loves his children, and Necile lay at his feet with many of her sisters, and earnestly hearkened as he spoke. "We live so happily, my fair ones, in our forest glades," said Ak, stroking his grizzled beard thoughtfully, "that we know nothing of the sorrow and misery that fall to the lot of those poor mortals who inhabit the open spaces of the earth. They are not of our race, it is true, yet compassion well befits beings so fairly favored as ourselves. Often as I pass by the dwelling of some suffering mortal, I am tempted to stop and banish the poor thing's misery. Yet suffering, in moderation, is the natural lot of mortals, and it is not our place to interfere with the laws of nature." "Nevertheless," said the fair queen, nodding her golden head at the master woodsman, "it would not be a vain guess that Ak has often assisted those hapless mortals." Ak smiled. "Sometimes," he replied, "when they are very young, children the mortals call them, I have stopped to rescue them from misery. The men and women I dare not interfere with. They must bear the burdens nature's imposed upon them. But the helpless infants, the innocent children of men, have a right to be happy until they become full grown and able to bear the trials of humanity. So I feel I am justified in assisting them. Not long ago, a year maybe, I found 4 poor children huddled in a wooden hut, slowly freezing to death. Their parents had gone to a neighboring village for food, and had left a fire to warm their little ones while they were absent. But a storm arose and drifted the snow in their path, so they were long on the road. Meantime, the fire went out, and the frost crept into the bones of the waiting children." "Poor things," murmured the queen softly. "What did you do?" "I called Nelko, bidding him fetch wood from my forests, and breathe upon it until the fire blazed again and warmed the little room where the children lay. Then they ceased shivering and fell asleep until their parents came." I am glad you did thus, said the good queen, beaming upon the master, and Necile, who had eagerly listened to every word, echoed in a whisper, I too am glad. And this very night, continued Ock, as I came to the edge of Bursey, I heard a feeble cry, which I judged came from a human infant. I looked about me and found, close to the forest, a helpless babe lying quite naked upon the grasses and wailing piteously. Not far away, screened by the forest, crouched Shiegra, the lioness, intent upon devouring the infant for her evening meal. And what did you do, Ock? Asked the queen breathlessly. Not much, being in a hurry to greet my nymphs, but I commanded Shiegra to lie close to the babe, and to give it her milk to quiet its hunger. And I told her to send word throughout the forest, to all beasts and reptiles, that the child should not be harmed. I am glad you did thus, said the good queen again, in a tone of relief. But this time Necile did not echo her words, for the nymph, filled with a strange resolve, had suddenly stolen away from the group. Swiftly her lithe form darted through the forest paths, until she reached the edge of mighty Bursey, where she paused to gaze curiously about her. Never until now had she ventured so far, for the law of the forest had placed the nymphs in its inmost depths. Necile knew she was breaking the law, but the thought did not give pause to her dainty feet. She had decided to see with her own eyes this infant Ock had told of, for she had never yet beheld a child of man. All the immortals are full grown. There are no children among them. Peering through the trees, Necile saw the child lying on the grass, but now it was sweetly sleeping, having been comforted by the milk drawn from Shiegra. It was not old enough to know what peril means. If it did not feel hunger, it was content. Softly the nymph stole to the side of the babe, and knelt upon the sward, her long robe of rose-leaf color spreading about her like a gossamer cloud. Her lovely countenance expressed curiosity and surprise, but most of all, a tender, womanly pity. The babe was newborn, chubby and pink. It was entirely helpless. While the nymph gazed, the infant opened its eyes, smiled upon her, and stretched out two dimpled arms. In another instant, Necile had caught it to her breast and was hurrying with it through the forest paths. The adoption. The master woodsman suddenly rose, with knitted brows. There is a strange presence in the forest, he declared. Then the queen and her nymphs turned and saw standing before them Necile, with the sleeping infant clasped tightly in her arms, and a defiant look in her deep blue eyes. And thus for a moment they remained, the nymphs filled with surprise and consternation, but the brow of the master woodsman gradually clearing as he gazed intently upon the beautiful immortal who had wilfully broken the law. Then the great Ock, to the wonder of all, laid his hand softly on Necile's flowing locks, and kissed her on her fair forehead. For the first time within my knowledge, said he, gently, a nymph has defied me and my laws. Yet in my heart I can find no word of chiding. What is your desire, Necile? Let me keep the child, she answered, beginning to tremble and falling on her knees in supplication. Here, in the forest of Bursey, where the human race has never yet penetrated, questioned Ock. Here in the forest of Bursey, replied the nymph boldly. It is my home, and I am weary for lack of occupation. Let me care for the babe. See how weak and helpless it is. Surely it cannot harm Bursey, nor the master woodsman of the world. But the law, child, the law, cried Ock sternly. The law is made by the master woodsman, returned Necile. If he bids me care for the babe he himself has saved from death, who in all the world dare oppose me? Queen Zerline, who had listened intently to this conversation, clapped her pretty hands gleefully at the nymph's answer. You are fairly trapped, O Ock, she exclaimed, laughing. Now, I pray you, give heed to Necile's petition. The woodsman, as was his habit when in thought, stroked his grizzled beard slowly. Then he said, She shall keep the babe, and I will give it my protection. But I warn you, all that as this is the first time I have relaxed the law, so shall it be the last time. Nevermore, to the end of the world, shall a mortal be adopted by an immortal. Otherwise we would abandon our happy existence for one of trouble and anxiety. Good night, my nymphs." Then Ak was gone from their midst, and Necile hurried away to her bower to rejoice over her new-found treasure. Chapter 4. Claws. Another day found Necile's bower the most popular place in the forest. The nymphs clustered around her, and the child that lay asleep in her lap, with expressions of curiosity and delight. Nor were they wanting in praises for the great Ak's kindness in allowing Necile to keep the babe and to care for it. Even the queen came to peer into the innocent childish face, and to hold a helpless, chubby fist in her own fair hand. "What shall we call him, Necile?" she asked, smiling. "He must have a name, you know." "Let him be called Klaus," answered Necile, "for that means a little one." "Rather let him be called Niklaus," returned the queen, "for that will mean Necile's little one." The nymphs clapped their hands in delight, and Niklaus became the infant's name, although Necile loved best to call him Klaus, and in after days many of her sisters followed her example. Necile gathered the softest moss in all the forest for Klaus to lie upon, and she made his bed in her own bower. Of food the infant had no lack. The nymphs searched the forest for bell udders, which grew upon the goa tree, and when opened are found to be filled with sweet milk. And the soft-eyed does willingly gave a share of their milk to support the little stranger, while Shiegra, the lioness, often crept stealthily into Necile's bower, and purred softly as she lay beside the babe and fed it. So the little one flourished, and grew big and sturdy day by day, while Necile taught him to speak and to walk and to play. His thoughts and words were sweet and gentle, for the nymphs knew no evil, and their hearts were pure and loving. He became the pet of the forest, for Ak's decree had forbidden beast or reptile to molest him, and he walked fearlessly wherever his will guided him. Presently, the news reached the other immortals that the nymphs of Burzee had adopted a human infant, and that the act had been sanctioned by the great Ak. Therefore, many of them came to visit the little stranger, looking upon him with much interest. First the rills, who are first cousins to the wood nymphs, although so differently formed. For the rills are required to watch over the flowers and plants, as the nymphs watch over the forest trees. They search the wide world for the food required by the roots of the flowering plants, while the brilliant colors possessed by the full-blown flowers are due to the dyes placed in the soil by the rills, which are drawn through the little veins in the roots and the body of the plants as they reach maturity. The rills are a busy people, for their flowers bloom and fade continually, but they are merry and light-hearted, and are very popular with the other immortals. Next came the Nooks, whose duty it is to watch over the beasts of the world, both gentle and wild. The Nooks have a hard time of it, since many of the beasts are ungovernable and rebel against restraint. But they know how to manage them after all, and you will find that certain laws of the Nooks are obeyed by even the most ferocious of animals. Their anxieties make the Nooks look old and worn and crooked, and their natures are a bit rough from associating with wild creatures continually. Yet they are the most useful to humanity, and to the world in general, as their laws are the only laws the forest beasts recognize, except those of the master woodsman. Then there were the fairies, the guardians of mankind, who were much interested in the adoption of Klaus, because their own laws forbade them to become familiar with their human charges. There are instances on record where the fairies have shown themselves to human beings, and have even conversed with them, but they are supposed to guard the lives of mankind, unseen and unknown. And if they favor some people more than others, it is because these have won such distinction fairly, as the fairies are very just and impartial. But the idea of adopting a child of men had never occurred to them, because it was in every way opposed to their laws. So their curiosity was intense to behold the little stranger adopted by Necile and her sister nymphs. Klaus looked upon the immortals who thronged around him with fearless eyes and smiling lips. He rode laughingly upon the shoulders of the merry rills. He mischievously pulled the gray beards of the low-browed Nooks. He rested his curly head confidently upon the dainty bosom of the fairy queen herself, and the rills loved the sound of his laughter. The nooks loved his courage, and the fairies loved his innocence. The boy made friends of them all, and learned to know their laws intimately. No forest flower was trampled beneath his feet, lest the friendly rills should be aggrieved. He never interfered with the beasts of the forest, lest his friends the nooks should become angry. The fairies he loved dearly, but knowing nothing of mankind, he could not understand that he was the only one of his race admitted to friendly intercourse with them. Indeed, Klaus came to consider that he alone of all the forest people had no like nor fellow. To him, the forest was the world. He had no idea that millions of toiling, striving human creatures existed, and he was happy and content. Some people have spelled this name Niklas and others Nicholas, which is the reason that Santa Claus is still known in some lands as Saint Nicholas. But of course, Niklaus is his right name, and Klaus the nickname given him by his adopted mother, the fair nymph Necile. Chapter 5. The Master Woodsman. Years pass swiftly in Burzee, for the nymphs have no need to regard time in any way. Even centuries make no change in the dainty creatures. Ever and ever they remain the same, immortal and unchanging. Klaus, however, being mortal, grew to manhood day by day. Necile was disturbed presently to find him too big to lie in her lap, and he had a desire for food other than milk. His stout legs carried him far into Burzee's heart, where he gathered supplies of nuts and berries, as well as several sweet and wholesome roots, which suited his stomach better than the bell udders. He sought Necile's bower less frequently, till finally it became his custom to return thither only to sleep. The nymph, who had come to love him dearly, was puzzled to comprehend the changed nature of her charge, and unconsciously altered her own mode of life to conform to his whims. She followed him readily through the forest paths, as did many of her sister nymphs, explaining as they walked all the mysteries of the gigantic wood, and the habits and nature of the living things which dwelt beneath its shade. The language of the beasts became clear to little Klaus, but he never could understand their sulky and morose tempers. Only the squirrels, the mice, and the rabbits seemed to possess cheerful and merry natures. Yet would the boy laugh when the panther growled, and stroked the bear's glossy coat, while the creature snarled and bared its teeth menacingly. The growls and snarls were not for Klaus, he well knew, so what did they matter? He could sing the songs of the bees, recite the poetry of the woodflowers, and relate the history of every blinking owl in Burzee. He helped the rills to feed their plants, and the nooks to keep order among the animals. The little immortals regarded him as a privileged person, being especially protected by Queen Zerline and her nymphs, and favored by the great Ak himself. One day, the master woodsman came back to the forest of Burzee. He had visited in turn all his forests throughout the world, and they were many and broad. Not until he entered the glade where the queen and her nymphs were assembled to greet him did Ak remember the child he had permitted Necile to adopt. Then he found, sitting familiarly in the circle of lovely immortals, a broad-shouldered, stalwart youth, who, when erect, stood fully as high as the shoulder of the master himself. Ak paused, silent and frowning, to bend his piercing gaze upon Klaus. The clear eyes met his own steadfastly, and the woodsman gave a sigh of relief as he marked their placid depths and read the youth's brave and innocent heart. Nevertheless, as Ak sat beside the fair queen, and the golden chalice, filled with rare nectar, passed from lip to lip, the master woodsman was strangely silent and reserved, and stroked his beard many times with a thoughtful motion. With morning, he called Klaus aside in kindly fashion, saying, "Bid good-bye for a time to Necile and her sisters, for you shall accompany me on my journey through the world." The venture pleased Klaus, who knew very well the honor of being companion of the master woodsman of the world. But Necile wept for the first time in her life, and clung to the boy's neck as if she could not bear to let him go. The nymph who had mothered this sturdy youth was still as dainty, as charming and beautiful as when she had dared to face Ak with the babe clasped to her breast, nor was her love less great. Ak beheld the two clinging together, seemingly as brother and sister to one another, and again he wore his thoughtful look. Klaus discovers humanity. Taking Klaus to a small clearing in the forest, the master said, "Place your hand upon my girdle, and hold fast while we journey through the air. For now we shall encircle the world and look upon many of the haunts of those men from whom you are descended." All the magic girdles, I swear. These words caused Klaus to marvel, for until now he had thought himself the only one of his kind upon the earth. Yet in silence he grasped firmly the girdle of the great Ak, his astonishment forbidding speech. Then the vast forest of Burzy seemed to fall away from their feet, and the youth found himself passing swiftly through the air at a great height. Ere long there were spires beneath them, while buildings of many shapes and colors met their downward view. It was a city of men, and Ak, pausing to descend, led Klaus to its enclosure. Said the master, "So long as you hold fast to my girdle, you will remain unseen by all mankind, though seeing clearly yourself. To release your grasp will be to separate yourself forever from me and your home in Burzy." One of the first laws of the forest is obedience, and Klaus had no thought of disobeying the master's wish. He clung fast to the girdle and remained invisible. Stupid phone. Thereafter, with each moment passed in the city, the youth's wonder grew. He, who had supposed himself created differently from all others, now found the earth swarming with creatures of his own kind. "Indeed," said Ak, "the immortals are few, but the mortals are many." Klaus looked earnestly upon his fellows. There were sad faces, gay and reckless faces, pleasant faces, anxious faces, and kindly faces, all mingled in puzzling disorder. Some worked at tedious tasks. Some strutted in impudent conceit. Some were thoughtful and grave, while others seemed happy and content. Men of many natures were there, as everywhere, and Klaus found much to please him, and much to make him sad. But especially he noted the children, first curiously, and then eagerly, and then lovingly. Ragged little ones rolled in the dust of the streets, playing with scraps and pebbles. Other children, gaily dressed, were propped upon cushions and fed with sugar plums. Yet the children of the rich were not happier than those playing with the dust and pebbles, it seemed to Klaus. "Childhood is the time of man's greatest content," said Ak, following the youth's thoughts. "'Tis during these years of innocent pleasure that the little ones are most free from care." "Tell me," said Klaus, "why do not all these babies fare alike?" "Because they are born in both cottage and palace," returned the master. "The difference in the wealth of the parents determines the lot of the child. Some are carefully tended and clothed in silks and dainty linen. Others are neglected and covered with rags." "Yet all seem equally fair and sweet," said Klaus thoughtfully. "While there are babes, yes," agreed Ak. "Their joy in being alive, and they do not stop to think. In after years, the doom of mankind overtakes them, and they find they must struggle and worry, work and fret, to gain the wealth that is so dear to the hearts of men. Such things are unknown in the forest where you were reared." Klaus was silent a moment. Then he asked, "Why was I reared in the forest, among those who were not of my race?" Then Ak, in gentle voice, told him the story of his babyhood, how he had been abandoned at the forest's edge and left a prey to wild beasts, and how the loving nymph Necile had rescued him and brought him to manhood under the protection of the immortals. "Yet I am not of them," said Klaus musingly. "You are not of them," returned the woodsman. "The nymph who cared for you as a mother seems now like a sister to you. By and by, when you grow old and gray, she will seem like a daughter. Yet another brief span, and you will be but a memory, while she remains Necile." "Then why, if man must perish, is he born?" demanded the boy. "Everything perishes, except the world itself and its keepers," answered Ak. "But while life lasts, everything on earth has its use. The wise seek ways to be helpful to the world, for the helpful ones are sure to live again." Much of this Klaus failed to understand fully, but a longing seized him to become helpful to his fellows, and he remained grave and thoughtful while they resumed their journey. They visited many dwellings of men in many parts of the world, watching farmers toil in the fields, warriors dash into the cruel fray, and merchants exchange their goods for bits of white and yellow metal. And everywhere the eyes of Klaus sought out the children in love and pity, for the thought of his own helpless babyhood was strong within him, and he yearned to give help to the innocent little ones of his race, even as he had been succored by the kindly nymph. Day by day the master woodsman and his pupil traversed the earth, Hawk speaking but seldom to the youth, who clung steadfastly to his girdle, but guiding him into all places where he might become familiar with the lives of human beings. And at last they returned to the grand old forest of Burzee, where the master set Klaus down within the circle of nymphs, among whom the pretty Necile anxiously awaited him. The brow of the great Ak was now calm and peaceful, but the brow of Klaus had become lined with deep thought. Necile sighed at the change in her foster son, who until now had been ever joyous and smiling, and the thought came to her that never again would the life of the boy be the same as before this eventful journey with the master. Klaus leaves the forest. When good Queen Zerline had touched the golden chalice with her fair lips, and it had passed around the circle in honor of the traveler's return, the master woodsman of the world, who had not yet spoken, turned his gaze frankly upon Klaus and said, "Well?" The boy understood and rose slowly to his feet beside Necile. Once only his eyes passed around the familiar circle of nymphs, every one of whom he remembered as a loving comrade. But tears came unbidden to dim his sight, so he gazed thereafter steadfastly at the master. "I have been ignorant," said he simply, "until the great Ak in his kindness taught me who and what I am. You who live so sweetly in your forest bowers, ever fair and youthful and innocent, are no fit comrades for a son of humanity. For I have looked upon man, finding him doomed to live for a brief space upon earth, to toil for the things he needs, to fade into old age, and then to pass away as the leaves in autumn. Yet every man has his mission, which is to leave the world better, in some way, than he found it. I am of the race of men, and man's lot is my lot. For your tender care of the poor forsaken babe you adopted, as well as for your loving comradeship during my boyhood, my heart will ever overflow with gratitude. My foster mother," here he stopped and kissed Necile's white forehead, "I shall love and cherish while life lasts. But I must leave you, to take my part in the endless struggle to which humanity is doomed, and to live my life in my own way." "What will you do?" asked the queen gravely. "I must devote myself to the care of the children of mankind, and try to make them happy," he answered. "Since your own tender care of a babe brought to me happiness and strength, it is just and right that I devote my life to the pleasure of other babes. Thus will the memory of the loving nymph Necile be planted within the hearts of thousands of my race for many years to come, and her kindly act be recounted in song and in story while the world shall last. Have I spoken well, O master?" "You have spoken well," returned Ak, and returning to his feet, he continued, "Yet one thing must not be forgotten. Having been adopted as the child of the forest, and the playfellow of the nymphs, you have gained a distinction which forever separates you from your kind. Therefore, when you go forth into the world of men, you shall retain the protection of the forest, and the powers you now enjoy will remain with you to assist you in your labors. In any need you may call upon the nymphs, the rills, the nooks, and the fairies, and they will serve you gladly. I, the master woodsman of the world, have said it, and my word is the law." Klaus looked at the words are hard. Klaus looked upon Ak with grateful eyes. "This will make me mighty among men," he replied. "Protected by these kind friends, I may be able to make thousands of little children happy. I will try very hard to do my duty, and I know the forest people will give me their sympathy and help." "We will," said the fairy queen earnestly. "We will," cried the merry rills, laughing. "We will," shouted the crooked nooks, scowling. "We will," exclaimed the sweet nymphs proudly. But Necile said nothing. She only folded Klaus in her arms and kissed him tenderly. "The world is big," continued the boy, turning again to his loyal friends, "but men are everywhere. I shall begin my work near my friends, so that if I meet with misfortune, I can come to the forest for counsel or help." With that, he gave them all a loving look and turned away. There was no need to say goodbye. Bye for him. I think that's a typo. But for him, the sweet wild life of the forest was over. He went forth bravely to meet his doom, the doom of the race of man, the necessity to worry and work. But Ak, who knew the boy's heart, was merciful and guided his steps. Coming through Burzy to its eastern edge, Klaus reached the laughing valley of the Ho-Ha-Ho. On each side were rolling green hills, and a brook wandered midway between them to wind afar off beyond the valley. At his back was the grim forest. At the far end of the valley, a broad plain. The eyes of the young man, which had until now reflected his grave thoughts, became brighter as he stood silent, looking out upon the laughing valley. Then, on a sudden, his eyes twinkled, as stars do on a still night, and he grew merry and wide. For at his feet the cowslips and daisies smiled on him in friendly regard. The breeze whistled gaily as it passed by, and fluttered the locks on his forehead. The brook laughed joyously as it leaped over the pebbles and swept around the green curves of its banks. And the bees sang sweet songs as they flew from dandelion to daffodil. The beetles chirruped happily in the long grass, and the sunbeams glinted pleasantly over all the scene. "Here," cried Klaus, stretching out his arms as if to embrace the valley, "will I make my home." That was many, many years ago. It has been his home ever since. It is his home now. Now we're in the manhood section. Chapter 1 of Manhood, The Laughing Valley. When Klaus came, the valley was empty save for the grass, the brook, the wildflowers, the bees, and the butterflies. If he would make his home here and live after the fashion of men, he must have a house. This puzzled him at first, but while he stood smiling in the sunshine, he suddenly found beside him old Nelko, the servant of the master woodsman. Nelko bore an axe, strong and broad, with blade that gleamed like burnished silver. This he placed in the young man's hand, then disappeared without a word. Klaus understood, and turning to the forest's edge, he selected a number of fallen tree trunks, which he began to clear of their dead branches. He would not cut into a living tree. His life among the nymphs who guarded the forest had taught him that a live tree is sacred, being a created thing endowed with feeling. But with the dead and fallen trees it was different. They had fulfilled their destiny as active members of the forest community, and now it was fitting that their remains should minister to the needs of man. The axe bit deep into the logs at every stroke. It seemed to have a force of its own, and Klaus had but to swing and guide it. When shadows began creeping over the green hills to lie in the valley overnight, the young man had chopped many logs into equal lengths and proper shapes for building a house such as he had seen the poorer classes of men inhabit. Then, resolving to await another day before he tried to fit the logs together, Klaus ate some of the sweet roots he well knew how to find, drank deeply from the laughing brook, and lay down to sleep on the grass, first seeking a spot where no flowers grew, lest the weight of his body should crush them. And while he slumbered and breathed in the perfume of the wondrous valley, the spirit of happiness crept into his heart and drove out all terror and care and misgivings. Never more would the face of Klaus be clouded with anxieties. Never more would the trials of life weigh him down as with a burden. The laughing valley had claimed him for its own. Would that we might all live in that delightful place. But then, maybe, it would become overcrowded. For ages it had awaited a tenant. Was it chance that led young Klaus to make his home in this happy vale? Or may we guess that his thoughtful friends, the immortals, had directed his steps when he wandered away from Burzy to seek a home in the great world? Certain it is that while the moon peered over the hilltop and flooded with its soft beams the body of the sleeping stranger, the laughing valley was filled with the queer, crooked shapes of the friendly nooks. These people spoke no words, but worked with skill and swiftness. The logs Klaus had trimmed with his bright axe were carried to a spot beside the brook, and fitted one upon another, and during the night a strong and roomy dwelling was built. The birds came sweeping into the valley at daybreak, and their songs, so seldom heard in the deep wood, aroused the stranger. He rubbed the web of sleep from his eyelids and looked around. The house met his gaze. "I must thank the Nooks for this," said he gratefully. Then he walked to his dwelling and entered at the doorway. A large room faced him, having a fireplace at the end and a table and bench in the middle. Beside the fireplace was a cupboard. Another doorway was beyond. Klaus entered here also and saw a smaller room with a bed against the wall and a stool set near a small stand. On the bed were many layers of dried moss brought from the forest. "Indeed, it is a palace," exclaimed the smiling Klaus. "I must thank the good Nooks again, for their knowledge of man's needs as well as for their labors in my behalf." He left his new home with a glad feeling that he was not quite alone in the world, although he had chosen to abandon his forest life. Friendships are not easily broken, and the immortals are everywhere. Upon reaching the brook, he drank of the pure water, and then sat down on the bank to laugh at the mischievous gambols of the ripples as they pushed one another against rocks, or crowded desperately to see which should first reach the turn beyond. And as they raced away, he listened to the song they sang. "Rushing, pushing, on we go. Not a wave may gently flow. All are too excited, every drop delighted, turns to spray and merry play, as we tumble on our way." Next, Klaus searched for roots to eat, while the daffodils turned their little eyes up to him laughingly, and lisped their dainty song. Blooming fairly, growing rarely, never flowerets were so gay, perfume breathing, joy bequeathing, as our colors we display. It made Klaus laugh to hear the little things voice their happiness as they nodded gracefully on their stems. But another strain caught his ear, as the sunbeams fell gently across his face and whispered, "Here is gladness that our rays warm the valleys through the days. Here is happiness to give comfort unto all who live." "Yes," cried Klaus in answer, "there is happiness and joy in all things here. The Laughing Valley is a valley of peace and goodwill." He passed the day talking with the ants and beetles and exchanging jokes with the light-hearted butterflies. And at night he lay on his bed of soft moss and slept soundly. Then came the fairies, merry but noiseless, bringing skillets and pots and dishes and pans and all the tools necessary to prepare food and to comfort a mortal. With these they filled cupboard and fireplace, finally placing a stout suit of wool clothing on the stool by the bedside. When Klaus awoke, he rubbed his eyes again and laughed, and spoke aloud his thanks to the fairies and the master woodsman who had sent them. With eager joy he examined all his new possessions, wondering what some might be used for. But in the days when he had clung to the girdle of the great Ak and visited the cities of men, his eyes had been quick to note all the manners and customs of the race to which he belonged. So he guessed from the gifts brought by the fairies that the master expected him hereafter to live in the fashion of his fellow creatures. "Which means I must plow the earth and plant corn," he reflected, "so that when winter comes I shall have garnered food in plenty." But as he stood in the grassy valley, he saw that to turn up the earth in furrows would be to destroy hundreds of pretty, helpless flowers, as well as thousands of the tender blades of grass, and this he could not bear to do. Therefore he stretched out his arms and uttered a peculiar whistle he had learned in the forest, afterward crying, "Rills of the field flowers, come to me." Instantly a dozen of the queer little rills were squatting upon the ground before him, and they nodded to him in cheerful greeting. Klaus gazed upon them earnestly. "Your brothers of the forest," he said, "I have known and loved many years. I shall love you also when we have become friends. To me the laws of the rills, whether those of the forest or of the field, are sacred. I have never willfully destroyed one of the flowers you tend so carefully. But I must plant grain to use for food during the cold winter. And how am I to do this without killing the little creatures that sing to me so prettily of their fragrant blossoms?" The yellow rill, he who tends the buttercups, made answer, "Fret not, friend Klaus. The great Ak has spoken to us of you. There is better work for you in life than to labor for food. And though, Not being of the forest, Ak has no command over us. Nevertheless are we glad to favor one he loves. Live, therefore, to do the good work you are resolved to undertake. We, the field rills, will attend to your food supplies." After this speech, the rills were no longer to be seen, and Klaus drove from his mind the thought of tilling the earth. When next he wandered back to his dwelling, a bowl of fresh milk stood upon the table. Bread was in the cupboard, and sweet honey filled a dish beside it. A pretty basket of rosy apples and new-plucked grapes was also awaiting him. He called out, "Thanks, my friends," to the invisible rills, and straightway began to eat of the food. Thereafter, when hungry, he had but to look into the cupboard to find goodly supplies brought by the kindly rills. And the Nooks cut and stacked much wood for his fireplace, and the fairies brought him warm blankets and clothing. So began his life in the Laughing Valley, with the favor and friendship of the immortals to minister to his every want. How Klaus made his first toy. Truly our Klaus had wisdom, for his good fortune but strengthened his resolve to befriend the little ones of his own race. He knew his plan was approved by the immortals, else they would not have favored him so greatly. So he began at once to make acquaintance with mankind. He walked through the valley to the plain beyond, and crossed the plain in many directions to reach the abodes of men. These stood singly or in groups of dwellings called villages, and in nearly all the houses, whether big or little, Klaus found children. The youngsters soon came to know his merry, laughing face, and the kind glance of his bright eyes. And the parents, while they regarded the young man with some scorn for loving children more than their elders, were content that the girls and boys had found a playfellow who seemed willing to amuse them. So the children romped and played games with Klaus, and the boys rode upon his shoulders, and the girls nestled in his strong arms, and the babies clung fondly to his knees. Wherever the young man chanced to be, the sound of childish laughter followed him, and to understand this better, you must know that children were much neglected in those days, and received little attention from their parents, so that it became to them a marvel that so goodly a man as Klaus devoted his time to making them happy. And those who knew him were, you may be sure, very happy indeed. The sad faces of the poor and abused grew bright for once. The cripples smiled despite his misfortune. The ailing ones hushed their moans, and the grieved ones their cries, when their merry friend came nigh to comfort them. Only at the beautiful palace of the Lord of Lurd, and at the frowning castle of the Baron Brown, was Klaus refused admittance. There were children at both places, but the servants at the palace shut the door in the young stranger's face, and the fierce baron threatened to hang him from an iron hook on the castle walls. Whereupon Klaus sighed, and went back to the poorer dwellings where he was welcome. After a time, the winter drew near. The flowers lived out their lives, and faded and disappeared. The beetles burrowed far into the warm earth. The butterflies deserted the meadows, and the voice of the brook grew hoarse, as if it had taken cold. One day, snowflakes filled all the air in the Laughing Valley, dancing boisterously toward the earth, and clothing in pure white raiment the roof of Klaus's dwelling. At night, Jack Frost rapped at the door. "Come in," cried Klaus. "Come out," answered Jack, "for you have a fire inside." So Klaus came out. He had known Jack Frost in the forest, and liked the jolly rogue, even while he mistrusted him. "There will be rare sport for me tonight," Klaus shouted the sprite. "Isn't this glorious weather? I shall nip scores of noses and ears and toes before daybreak." "If you love me, Jack, spare the children," begged Klaus. "And why?" asked the other in surprise. "They are tender and helpless," answered Klaus. "But I love to nip the tender ones," declared Jack. "The older ones are tough and tire my fingers." "The young ones are weak and cannot fight you," said Klaus. "True," agreed Jack thoughtfully. "Well, I will not pinch a child this night, if I can resist the temptation," he promised. "Good night, Klaus." "Good night." The young man went in and closed the door, and Jack Frost ran on to the nearest village. Klaus threw a log on the fire, which burned up brightly. Beside the hearth sat Blinky, a big cat given him by Peter the Nook. Her fur was soft and glossy, and she purred never-ending songs of contentment. "I shall not see the children again soon," said Klaus to the cat, who kindly paused in her song to listen. "The winter is upon us, The snow will be deep for many days, and I shall be unable to play with my little friends." The cat raised a paw and stroked her nose thoughtfully, but made no reply. So long as the fire burned and Klaus sat in his easy chair by the hearth, she did not mind the weather. So passed many days and many long evenings. The cupboard was always full, but Klaus became weary with having nothing to do more than to feed the fire from the big wood pile the Knooks had brought him. One evening he picked up a stick of wood and began to cut it with his sharp knife. He had no thought at first except to occupy his time, and he whistled and sang to the cat as he carved away portions of the stick. Puss sat up on her haunches and watched him, listening at the same time to her master's merry whistle, which she loved to hear even more than her own purring songs. Klaus glanced at Puss, and then at the stick he was whittling, until presently the wood began to have the shape, and the shape was like the head of a cat, with 2 ears sticking upwards. Klaus stopped whistling to laugh, and then both he and the cat looked at the wooden image in some surprise. Then he carved out the eyes and the nose, and rounded the lower part of the head so that it rested upon a neck. Puss hardly knew what to make of it now, and sat up stiffly, as if watching with some suspicion what would come next. Klaus knew. The head gave him an idea. He plied his knife carefully and with skill, forming slowly the body of the cat, which he made to sit upon its haunches as the real cat did, with her tail wound around her 2 front legs. The work cost him much time, but the evening was long and he had nothing better to do. Finally, he gave a loud and delighted laugh at the result of his labors, and placed the wooden cat, now completed, upon the hearth opposite the real one. Puss thereupon glared at her image, raised her hair in anger, and uttered a defiant mew. The wooden cat paid no attention, and Klaus, much amused, laughed again. Then Blinky advanced toward the wooden image to eye it closely and smell of it intelligently. Eyes and nose told her the creature was wood, in spite of its natural appearance, so Puss resumed her seat and her purring, but as she neatly washed her face with her padded paw, she cast more than one admiring glance at her clever master. Perhaps she felt the same satisfaction we feel when we look upon good photographs of ourselves. The cat's master was himself pleased with his handiwork, without knowing exactly why. Indeed, he had great cause to congratulate himself that night, and all the children throughout the world should have joined him in rejoicing, for Klaus had made his first toy. And we'll go ahead and end there, I think. What? We've only got a couple minutes left until time, and we should probably see if we can find somebody to raid. Let's see, we have Lady Luna Star, who's apparently doing tarot, and then Ishirna, the glass artist that we raided yesterday, is on as well. Yeah, I'm liking this one. Oh, stretch. So what do you guys think? Tarot or glass art? Are they on right now? So many commercials. doesn't look like a tarot card. Weird. Okay, so what do you think? Glass art or somewhat weird tarot readings? Although she does have a picture of... Nope, that was an image. There's a painting she'd done of cherry blossoms. Not that I like cherry blossoms or anything. You guys probably couldn't guess that. Yeah, I think so too. All right, let's go check out Miss Ashurna. If she was painting again, I might have gone for the painting, but not much interested in tarot readings. All right, away we go.